We learn to appreciate other cultures by learning about them. How? To my mind, the most important thing that we can do is read or engage with the great works of the different cultures. So in our schools, a great books course, or rather great books courses, should be mandatory in our system of education. So how is it that, I went through school in Israel, South Africa, and then I studied in the US, in the UK, and it was only later on when I actually moved there that I encountered Confucianism and Taoism. How is it that only in graduate school I came across Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart? Why are so many people have not read Greek mythology or the Bible? Whether you're religious or not, or the Bhagavad Gita, why aren't these mandatory readings in every culture around the world, in every school? Because when we learn the great books, then we gain an understanding of the DNA of a culture.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
You decided to upgrade your outdoor deck, so you ordered the essentials: a power washer, a set of patio chairs, and a shiny new grill. And you used your Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, choosing to earn 3% cash back on online shopping or up to 5.25% as a preferred rewards member, which you put towards the cost of your most essential deck addition, a bird feeder. Apply for yours at bankofamerica.com/more rewarding. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.
It wouldn't be the holiday season if there wasn't candy, right? Celebrate the holiday season with the Holiday Crush. They've sprinkled candy with a holiday theme and fun-packed challenges every week for 5 whole weeks, finishing on January 4th. The more challenges you complete, the better your chances of unwrapping delicious rewards. So, are you ready to crush the holidays? Play the Holiday Crush now. Download it from the App Store, Google Play, or Windows Store for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Capital One is using a serverless streaming architecture to enable real-time analysis. So if you have a higher tip than usual on a restaurant order, Capital One's intelligent assistant automatically reaches out when the charge is spotted to make sure you really mean it. Making banking better by building great customer experiences at scale. Learn more about how Capital One is using cloud-native architecture to feel the future at CapitalOne.com/cloud. Capital One, what's in your wallet? Limitations apply. Capital One Bank USA, North America. So I want to tell you about a new podcast called Future Positive, a podcast from the people at XPRIZE. This month, they're exploring artificial intelligence for good. Topics include how AI can help preserve indigenous languages, AI and self-driving cars, and how smart food systems will transform the way that we eat. They bring together big brains from all backgrounds to talk about the biggest challenges we face and the innovations that will have a positive impact on our futures. Expect insightful conversations with people that are changing the world from AI to climate change. If you love the guests in the Unmistakable Creative, I think you'll love the insanely interesting people on Future Positive. Listen and subscribe to XPRIZE Future Positive podcast today, wherever you get your pods. Tal, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So as I was saying before we hit record here, I have known about your work for a very, very long time. Many of your former proteges have actually been our own podcast guests. And in many ways, you're kind of like the godfather of this whole happiness movement to me. But before we get into your work, I want to start by asking you, where in the world did you grow up and what impact did where you grew up end up having on the choices that you've made with your life and career?
Yes, so I grew up the first 9 years of my life. I grew up in Israel and in a small city outside of Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan. And at the age of 9, we moved to South Africa. And I spent 5 years there till the age of 14, and then back to Israel, where I finished my high school and then went off to London to play on the professional squash circuit. And ever since then, I've been moving around. So I've lived in a number of countries, including in Europe, Holland, the UK, had another stint there later on, spent a few years in Singapore, and of course in the US.
Yeah. How did each one of these places influence, where you've ended up and your own sort of perception on this whole idea of happiness? But more importantly, how in the world did you escape the military service?
So
I thought it was mandatory.
I did not escape the military service. It's very difficult to do in Israel. There's a mandatory service for 3 years. So I graduated from high school early, and then had a few years playing on the professional circuit. And after that, had to go back to the army when I was almost 19, and spent 3 years in the army before coming to the US for college.
Yeah. So, I mean, each one of these things, there's such a diversity of experiences, all these different countries. I had to ask about the military experience because I'm always so curious about people who've served in the Israeli military. What do you think people have as misperceptions about that? What are the benefits that came from it? How did that end up impacting your life later on? Like, what are the valuable lessons that came from it?
I think the most important lesson was learning to appreciate things more, learning to appreciate life in general. But, I remember, arriving at Harvard for my undergrad and going into the dining hall with my new roommates and new friends. And I just couldn't believe the fact that they were complaining about the food. Because compared to army food, I felt like I was in a 5-star hotel. So, it's learning to appreciate the small things in life and not taking for granted what we do have. Having said that, if you'd asked me even today, would you have volunteered for those 3 years? I would not have. But, you have to do it. And, one of the ideas that I talk about a lot in my classes, in my teaching in organizations, is the idea that things don't always happen for the best. But we have the choice to make the best of things that happen. And this wasn't an explicit mantra, 30 years ago when I was in the military, but it certainly is one today. So even though I would not have volunteered, and I don't think, it's for the best that people go into the army, my dad told me that, or rather my grandfather told me that when my dad was born, he said, I hope that my son will not have to fight going to the military like I did. My dad was born in 1943. And my dad said the same thing. And when I was born, and I said the same thing when David, our eldest son, was born 16 years ago. But, it is what it is, and it's mandatory, and we do it. And the question is, how can you make the best of it, even if it is not for the best?
Yeah. So you've been in all these different places. So 2 questions from that. How did each culture impact you? What lessons did you learn from each one? And I always wonder this about immigrants because teaching at Harvard, I'm sure you probably have plenty of students who are Indian because, it's practically in our DNA to basically be overachievers because it's just what our parents instill in us. So I wonder, are Israeli parents the same way Indian parents are in terms of the way they encourage their kids with career paths?
So there are similarities between, the Jewish culture and the Indian culture, or in terms of emphasis on education. So education was always a priority. However, my parents never put any pressure on me. At least it was never explicit. But it was always, pursue your passions. And once I did identify passions, they were very supportive. So that's one thing. The second thing, and, this is especially thanks to my dad, who's a walking encyclopedia. It was always, we always heard stories, and there was always information, and there was always learning. And I think my parents, more than anything, led by example. So my mom is a microbiologist. My dad is a walking encyclopedia and an engineer. And they were always learning. And by the way, they're learning today. So my mom is in her 70s, and she's still taking courses in biology, on nutrition now. My dad as well is learning Spanish now. He's just turned 77. So I think they led by example, and learning was, and I think for many Jewish families, is a central key value.
Yeah. And as far as the culture of each one of these places, how did each one shape and influence your worldview about what's important, what matters, and even career choices?
So each place affected me. Let me start with the sum total, and then I'll go into the individual places. But the sum total taught me that a human being is a human being is a human being, meaning many people ask about how or in what way happiness is cultural. And the best answer to that actually comes from a story that I read about. It's written about in Daniel Goleman's book, Destructive Emotions, where he describes a meeting between Western scientists and Eastern scientists and practitioners. And the Dalai Lama was there, his right-hand men were there, as well as some of the leading researchers in the world from the US, from the UK, from Spain, France, from Latin America, were there to talk about happiness and dealing with destructive emotions. And it was a 5-day event, actually, which was held in the north of India. And around the third day, the Dalai Lama, after hearing dozens and dozens of speeches, presentations by both Eastern and Western scientists and practitioners, the Dalai Lama, raised his hand in his humble way and said, "May I say something?" And no one dared say no, of course. And he said, "Look, we've been here for 3 days almost, and we've heard so many lectures on cultural differences. And, they're great. The research is really interesting. However, I'm concerned. And my concern is that we're focusing too much on the differences and not enough on the similarities." Now, I think probably the last thing you can say about the Dalai Lama is that he is not culturally sensitive. He certainly is. At the same time, he also understands that a human being is a human being is a human being, and our similarities, we shouldn't lose sight of our similarities. So for instance, whether you live in Mumbai, in New York, in London, or in Nairobi, relationships are important to you. They're the number one predictor of happiness. Whether you live in any of these places or any other place, finding a sense of meaning in life is important. Physical exercise, movement is important. So these are the similarities that are important everywhere. And then there are cultural differences. There are cultures that are more individualistic, and there are cultures that are more collective, and cultures where success is more emphasized, or where sticking out is more important versus being the same. So yeah, of course, these are important differences that we need to study, while keeping in mind that we should not lose sight of the similarities and the universals. And in a sense, when we study happiness, we need to look at it. We need to study it on 3 levels. The first level is the universal, and we do research for that. The second level is cultural, and we need to do research for that. The third level is personal. And for that, rather than research, we need to engage in me-search, because there are many important individual differences as well. But that doesn't negate the fact that we needn't study culture as well as the universal. So this is what I think implicitly, without thinking about it or even noticing it consciously, I learned that whether I was in South Africa, whether I was in Israel, Singapore, US, or in Holland, the human needs were very, very similar. Now, from each country where I lived, I I derive different lessons. And let me just give you a couple of examples, because there are too many of them to list, but just a couple of examples. So in South Africa, I did experience a lot of anti-Semitism. We lived in a small town. It was a very small town, and I did experience a lot of anti-Semitism from in school. I got into many fights, being called a bloody Jew, regularly. Needless to say, that wasn't fun. But as Nietzsche said, if it doesn't kill you, which it didn't, it makes you stronger. So I do feel I became stronger, and also more sensitive to discrimination in general. Having experienced it firsthand, and having observed it from up close, because we were there during the apartheid era. And later on, when I no longer lived in South Africa, I had the privilege of working with Black children, creating a program or programs around positive psychology, helping raise self-esteem, both for children as well as for adults. Some of these programs sponsored directly by Nelson Mandela, whom I had the privilege of meeting. So I remained involved with South Africa, and still do work there long after I left. So, and I did it because it was the right thing to do, but also because I felt a strong, deep connection. 5 of my most formative years were spent there. And yes, I did experience discrimination, and I also experienced many wonderful, memorable moments there. So that's South Africa. Then, Israel. Israel is an interesting case study when it comes to happiness, because on paper, Israelis should not be happy. Israel is a country that has its fair share of problems, whether, first and foremost, political problems, a country at war. My first childhood memory is of war. I have a flashbulb memory of the Yom Kippur War, which was in 1973. And the siren going off, and me running down with my family to the shelter. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. That's 47 years ago. So, and yet, despite these experiences, Israelis are among the happiest people in the world. And the question is why? And the answer is actually quite straightforward and simple. When you look at all the countries that are at the top of the international rankings, countries like Israel, like Colombia, like Costa Rica, like Denmark. And when you look at these countries, the common element is relationships. So, there are certain conditions that have to be put in place. These the very poor countries where people don't have their basic, or where most people don't have their basic needs, they will not be among the happiest countries in the world for sure. Or countries that are ruled by dictators, or where where women are oppressed. These countries will not be happy. But once basic needs are met, relationships matter most. Take Denmark, for example. In Denmark, 93% of the population are members of social clubs, active members of social clubs. That's the highest rate in the world. It's no coincidence that they're among the happiest countries in the world. In Colombia and Israel, family is central. Friendships are central. This is why, despite the respective challenges, they're among the happiest countries in the world. And that's what I learned more than anything else in Israel. To invest in, to value, to prioritize relationships, whether it's with family, of course, as well as with friends.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I remember my sister got married about 2 years ago, and I was going through a particularly difficult period right around 2018. And we went to India as a family together for the first time in 25 years. And I looked at those 2 or 3 months, leading up to the wedding. And I noticed, I was like, wow, this is the happiest I've been in a really long time. And I realized it was because I was spending so much time with my family.
Amazing. Yeah. Again, it sounds so simple. And yet, in our modern world, relationships for many people has been taking a back seat.
So I want to ask you 2 questions about sort of Western culture. First, the discrimination piece. I've had 2 other guests from South Africa here, Srini Pillay and his wife, Uma Naidu, who both also were there during apartheid. And as somebody who has been in a country like South Africa during apartheid, when you see the divisiveness that is happening today in the United States, how do you react to that? Like, what does somebody like you think? Like, are you scared that we're about to have history repeat itself?
I don't know if, I think it was Mark Twain who said that history rarely repeats itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So I don't think I hope history won't repeat itself. However, we are certainly seeing divisiveness, and that is connected to, what I started off with, saying that we need to recognize and understand that we're much more similar than we're different. And I feel like there is too much emphasis on cultural differences, too much difference on ethnic differences. And again, not to belittle those. It's important to research them, to study them. However, we need to first and foremost recognize our humanity. Now, how do we recognize our humanity? This may seem like we're going off on a tangent, but it's very much related. We learn about, and we learn to appreciate other cultures by learning about them. How? To my mind, the most important thing that we can do is read or engage with the great works of the different cultures. So in our schools, I think it should, a great books course, or rather great books courses, should be mandatory in our system of education. So how is it that, I went through school in Israel, South Africa, and then I studied in the US, in the UK, and it was only later on, when I actually moved there, that I encountered Confucianism and Taoism. How is it that only in graduate school I came across Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart? Why are so many people have not read Greek mythology, Iliad and Odyssey, or the Bible? Whether you're religious or not, or the Bhagavad Gita. Why aren't these mandatory readings in every culture around the world, in every school? Because when we learn the great books, then we gain an understanding of the DNA of a culture. You understand Israel better if you read the Bible. You understand modern Israel, that is. You understand modern India better if you read the Gita, and especially if you read Gandhi's exegesis of the Gitas. So we need to, and same with Confucianism. I spent a lot of time in Singapore, a lot of time in China. Do I understand that culture? Not in depth, but thanks to reading and rereading Confucius and Mencius and Lao Tzu, I understand it a lot better. And I think that we can have a lot more empathy through understanding towards different cultures. In other words, we'd be brought together more if we have more of a common language. And right now, certainly in the U.S., the culture is we're speaking at each other rather than sharing things together.
holiday season means stocking up on some essentials like decorations and an ugly sweater. With a Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, you can choose to earn 3% cash back on online shopping. The essentials have never felt more rewarding. Visit bankofamerica.com/more rewarding to apply now. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.
What if you could forget about vacuuming for months at a time and still keep your house clean without lifting a finger? Sounds like a futuristic dream that's too good to be true. Well, it's not, because that's exactly what the Roomba i7 Plus robot vacuum does. I've been using one for months, and as a person who was traumatized by my mom's incessant need to keep our house cleaner than Buckingham Palace while I was growing up, having a robot that does our vacuum is so cool. I wonder how I ever lived without it. And the carpets where I live are so spotless that even my mother would be impressed. Powered by iRobot Genius, the Roomba i7 Plus robot vacuum is smarter than ever, learning where and when you normally clean and suggesting personalized schedules so you can focus on everything else. Plus, during allergy or pet shedding season, it can suggest extra cleanings to keep your house tidy year-round. The Roomba i7 Plus robot vacuum can clean specific messes for right when they happen, so if you're racing out the door and notice crumbs under the kitchen table, you can use the iRobot Home app or Google or Alexa voice assistant to tell your robot to immediately clean that spot and consider it done. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a perfect segue to talking specifically about education. But where I want to start is, how in the world do you end up at a place like Harvard, which is basically the breeding ground for future Goldman Sachs employees and lawyers, and end up choosing happiness as the subject that you're going to study? Because, you know, like most of my guests, happiness research is not something a high school guidance counselor says, yeah, this is what you should go and do.
Yeah, so I ended up at Harvard thanks to Saddam Hussein. Do you want me to explain? Or
yes, please. Absolutely.
It's not self-explanatory. No. All right. So here is why. So I served in the military in Israel between 89 and 92. And for at least the beginning of the military, they provided for some concessions for me because I was an athlete. So I was able to, I went to the military every day, but it was next to a squash court, so I could play almost every day. And once in a while, I traveled to Europe to play tournaments. So I basically maintained my level of squash, planning that as soon as I complete my military service at the age of 21, the next day I'll be off to England, to London, which is considered the Mecca of squash, and return to my professional career. But then I think it was the August 1990, I believe, Saddam invaded Kuwait. And as soon as he invaded Kuwait, the minute he invaded Kuwait, the Israeli military went on the highest alert. And at that moment, all privileges were revoked. And for the next, I think it was until the 15th of February, which is when the first Iraq war was over. Until then, I was basically in the military full time. No squash, no practice, nothing. I was extremely busy. And then I returned to squash again, and then I got injured again and again and again. And an injury that ended up ending my career, my professional squash career, because what happened during the time when I didn't play squash, the muscles in my back got very weak, and my joint went out of alignment. And the alignment was held as long as my muscles were tight. But when they weakened, when they became lax, then my joints literally moved, and that was a career-ending injury. And then I remembered that I met the Harvard squash coach a few years earlier, and he said, "Look, we'd love to. We have a squash team here. We'd love to recruit you so that you can come to Harvard." And I said to him, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to play professional." But given that I couldn't play professional, I could still play, but not at the highest levels. I called him up and I said, "Is the offer still on the table?" Gave him the whole spiel, and he said, "It sure is." And that's how I ended up at Harvard. I got injured thanks to Saddam Hussein, which changed the trajectory of, of my career.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I got into Harvard. I started off there as a computer science major. Both my parents, as engineer, microbiologist, I was always into the sciences. I was very interested in computer science. That's what I started to major in. And then my second year, so this was first semester of my sophomore year, I suddenly, caught myself and I said to myself, how is it that I'm in such a wonderful place with wonderful students, wonderful faculty, great food in the dining hall, and miserable? And it didn't make sense to me because, I looked at my life from the outside. Things were great. I was doing very well academically. In squash, I was doing well there. I had friends. Ostensibly, I should have been, the happiest person, and I was far from it. And it dawned on me, and this was my, first, insight about the field of happiness, which again today seems trivial, but it wasn't at the time. That happiness depends much more on the inside than on the outside. And it was in a day I just decided to basically change course. And I went to my academic advisor and telling her that I'm changing majors. And she said, "What to?" And I said, "I'm leaving computer science, moving over to philosophy and psychology." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "I have two questions. First question is, why aren't I happy? Second question, how can I become happier?" And it's with these two questions that I did my undergrad and then went over to the other Cambridge in England to read education, and then back to Harvard for my PhD, all the time focusing on how can I help myself, individuals, families, organizations, and ultimately nations increase levels of well-being. And haven't looked back since. That's what I've been doing. That's what I've been passionate about.
So, I contrast that to my own undergraduate experience at Berkeley, which, I look back now and think what a waste because I didn't leverage the opportunities that were at my disposal. But what I wonder is, why is it that you are self-aware enough at that age to question whether you are on the right path? Because I don't think a lot of people do. I think that for the most part, we choose from the options in front of us. And we're largely blind to the possibilities that surround us. And I think that's common for a lot of people. Like nobody ever taught me to see college as an opportunity for exploration and discovery. And that to me was one of the reasons I feel I missed out on so much at a place that should have been rich with opportunity.
I think part of it is definitely the age. Remember, I started, at the age of almost 22. I was a 22-year-old freshman. So that makes a difference. I had experiences before. I was in the military. I did live, abroad playing squash. So, a lot of it is experiences. Some of it is as a result of a blessing and a curse. And the blessing and the curse is that, I do tend towards introspection. The curse of it is that it also means rumination, and that is not always a prescription for happiness. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. But I'd like to add to that the over-examined life is tedious. So I certainly have often, and still do, fall too much into the over-examination. But at that stage in my life, that really helped, because I did need to reflect. And one of the things that not enough students in college or pre-college do is reflect. So they come in and, they get into a good college and they know the path that will get them into a top, investment banking job or consulting job or, the medical school or the law school or education. It doesn't matter, but they don't reflect on and what it is that they want to do. When so I was, very fortunate that my parents always encouraged us to reflect. And I was also fortunate to have good teachers. One of my teachers, the Israeli philosopher Ohad Kamin, I consulted with him when I graduated from college, because I didn't know which path I wanted to take. Did I want to go into business? At that time, I had a great offer to work in the business as an organizational behaviorist. So it's to include my love for psychology, as well as do something in the world. So I had a nice offer there. I was thinking of graduate school, maybe becoming an academic. I was already starting to teach then, so maybe to go into teaching. So I really was considering different paths. And I went to him and asked for advice. And he gave me the following advice. And he said, Tal, go home and journal. In your journal, make a list of all the things that you can do well. And then out of those things, identify the things that you want to do. And out of those things, find the things that you really want to do. And then find the things that you really, really want to do, and then go out and do them. In other words, what he did was help me create concentric circles. And again, whether the outer circle had, 20 things or 5 things, it doesn't matter. But the idea here is to hone in on those things where your strengths are, that you can do well or relatively well, and the things that you really, really want to do, that you're passionate about. And this was very good advice. And I actually did this not just then, also when I graduated from graduate school. I did something similar, because I also didn't know, do I want to remain in academia? What kind of academia? Where do I want to be? And this exercise has been very helpful for me. So a lot of it is about a reflection. There is not enough of it, certainly not when people go to college and when even when they're in their workplace. And sometimes when there is reflection and they realize, well, I should maybe be elsewhere, they're thinking, oh, but I've spent so many years already doing this. Or, I've already invested in my computer science prerequisites or my econ prerequisites. I'm not going to move now to philosophy. Or vice versa. People, my students, whether it's at Harvard or my students in the Happiness Studies Academy today, they very often tell me that the best thing that they get out of the course, is that they identify what are the things that they really, really want to do, and then go out and do them. And for some, it may be teaching. For some, it may be investment banking. It doesn't matter. But it's finding those things that you're passionate about.
Yeah. Well, I think that makes a perfect segue to talk about education in particular. I knew there was no way I was going to get out of a conversation with you without asking you about education, because I figure anybody who's an educator, my dad's a college professor, so we have all these, ongoing arguments, disagreements, and questions about education. But one of the things that you say in the book is ensuring that the process of learning is itself enjoyable is in part the responsibility of each student, especially in the college and graduate school where they have more independence. Yet by the time students are mature enough to take responsibility for their education, most have already internalized the rat racer's ethos. And we'll get into the archetypes that you talk about in just a second. But you're at Harvard, and Harvard in so many ways is the epitome of a person who is in the rat racer's ethos. I mean, the college admissions scandal is another, sort of byproduct of that. So when you look at education in its modern form, outside of talking about, reading the great books, like how do you change this rat racer's ethos, particularly in education, particularly where you have, helicopter parents? When I grew up in an Indian family, we were the kinds of people who nobody put our report cards on refrigerators when we got A's. It was like, you got anything less? It was like, what happened? What did you do wrong?
Mm. Yeah. So first of all, it's very challenging because the focus on achievement, on quantifiable achievement, like grades, like success, like money, wealth, accolades, the focus is so deeply rooted that it's difficult to get it out. Marty Seligman, who's considered the father of the positive psychology movement, often addresses parents and teachers, and he always begins with 2 questions. And the first question is, okay, help me. I want to create a list on the board. What would you most want for your children? And all parents around the world, again, this is universal, would say similar things. We want them to be happy, would probably be the first one. We want them to be resilient. We want them to have good relationships. We want them to love what they do. We want them to lead a full and fulfilling life. So he makes that list on one side of the board. And then he says, okay, this is question number one. Let's move over to question number two. What do children learn in school? And he makes a list on the board. And they learn, the 3 R's, and, reading, writing, arithmetic. They learn geography and history and biology, and the list goes on. There's almost no overlap between list number one and list number two. And the question is, why don't children learn how to become happy or how to cultivate healthy relationships? I would have understood that it wasn't in schools maybe 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but today we have a science of happiness. We know how to increase levels of well-being. We know how to cultivate resilience in children. Why isn't that taught in schools? And that is no less important than teaching mathematics or computer science or history. Now, I'm not belittling the importance of studying mathematics, history, and computer science. These are very important, and gaining skills for our livelihood are certainly important. However, why either or? Especially given the fact that if we cultivate happiness, if we teach people how to enjoy healthier relationships, better physical health, nutrition, they will also perform better as students, as employees in the workplace, as parents, as partners. So these are very important skills that are not taught in schools. I would introduce them from the outset, starting in kindergarten, or as early as children receive education. The form of education that does come close to it, in the form of education that I subscribe to, is Montessori. I think Maria Montessori was a genius. I think she had most of it right. And where she was able to combine between a real deep learning as well as cultivation of human skills.
Uh-huh. So I had to ask you, you mentioned parents, and you're a parent, as you mentioned earlier. And anytime I talk to a psychologist who happens to have the kind of background that you do, I'm always curious, are you immune to all the bullshit that most parents have to deal with when they have kids because you happen to have this knowledge base?
So our eldest son, David, was born 16 years ago. When he was 6, I went to one of my closest friends, Shirley Yuval. She's a child psychologist. She's my go-to person whenever I have questions. And I went to her and I said, Shirley, I wish I knew 6 years ago what I know today, because then I wouldn't have made all those mistakes. And she said to me, Tal, don't worry, you would have made other mistakes. And there's an important message here, because we do make mistakes as parents. We're not perfect parents, and it's a good thing that we're not perfect parents. So in the 1950s and 60s in England, a psychologist by the name of Donald Winnicott wrote about the good enough mother. The good enough mother. And he wrote about the mother because then fathers were hardly involved in child rearing, but it applies to fathers who are involved as much. And his idea there was that what children need are not perfect parents. What they need are good enough parents. And then he said, which means stop worrying, do your best. Of course, love your kid. Of course, I'm not talking about extreme cases, of abusive parenting, but, love your kids, and beyond that, do your best, and, continue to learn, to grow. Your children don't need a perfect machine. They need a good enough person, a real role model, in other words. Because take, for example, let's say a parent was so attentive to their child, perfectly attentive to their child. Well, their child wouldn't learn how to deal with inattentiveness, or wouldn't have learned how to deal with difficulties and hardships. Maria Montessori said, don't do for a child what a child can do for him or herself, which means letting them struggle letting them deal with difficulties. And part of the struggles come from the imperfection of the parent at one level or another. As I grow older, I become more and more grateful. I've always been grateful to my parents, but I become even more grateful because, I realize that, they really did their best. And moreover, even the mistakes that they made are mistakes that ultimately I have benefited from. Also, I guess I'm giving them more leeway as an indirect way of giving myself more leeway, because I see the mistakes that that I made and will make, no doubt. So the answer to your question, I'm very grateful to the field of positive psychology, the science of happiness. I've learned a lot, many of the things that I apply, and I see that my kids are benefiting from it. And yet, more important than anything else is that my kids encounter a real role model, and that I am hopefully a good enough father to them.
Wow. Well, let's get into the archetypes that you talk about. You talk about several archetypes in here: the rat race archetype, the hedonist archetype, the nihilism archetype, and the happiness archetype. And the rat race one caught me in particular because I feel like to some degree everybody is caught up in the rat race archetype. You say, we're not rewarded for enjoying the journey itself, but for the successful completion of a journey. Society rewards results, not processes, arrivals, not journeys. So can you go over what the archetypes are and how you basically transcend them?
Yes. So essentially the archetypes, the idea for the archetypes came from a visit to my favorite hamburger joint. Is that self-explanatory, or do I need to elaborate?
I think you'll have to go into that one.
All right. It was before a very important squash tournament, and I resolved for a month or two before the tournament to only eat very healthy foods. Now, in general, I ate healthfully, but as an athlete. But for that month or two was especially healthy, so only, fruits, vegetables, lean meat or fish. And then I said to myself that once the tournament is over, I will reward myself with a full-on junk food meal, which would mean going to my favorite hamburger joint and ordering, which I did, 4 hamburgers. And there was no doubt in my mind that I would devour the 4. I had a very big appetite. Played squash 6 hours a day. You need a lot of calories for that. And I remember buying those hamburgers and then walking over. And I went by myself because I said, this is something that I really want to focus on. No distractions. So I went by myself, sat down with the 4 hamburgers in front of me, and was about to bite into the first one, and I stopped. And even though I'd been looking forward to that meal for weeks, I stopped. And the reason why I stopped was because I felt so clean. My body felt so strong. I was so energetic, and I said, this hamburger may ruin that for me. And it was at that point that I came up with the hamburger model, which I later renamed the happiness model. And here is the hamburger model. So there are 4 different types of hamburgers. The first type is the hamburger that I just turned down. And that was a tasty hamburger, which I would certainly enjoy eating in the here and now, in the present. But in the future, I would have, paid a price. I wouldn't have felt so great. I would have been a bit weaker, lethargic as a result of this. So there was present benefit to that hamburger, but future detriment. Then there was another hamburger type, which was not tasty, but very healthy. For that hamburger type, it would be about future benefit, in that I would feel great after, because it was healthy, but present detriment. I wouldn't enjoy the meal. And then there was another hamburger type, which was the worst type, meaning the hamburger type which was not tasty and not healthy. So a lose-lose hamburger. And the 4th hamburger type was the winner, there was a hamburger which was very tasty, just like the one I had turned down, and very healthy. In other words, there was present benefit and future benefit. And I realized that each one of these archetypes describes an archetypal individual or a trait or a way of being in the world. So the first hamburger type, which is future benefit, present benefit, very tasty, future detriment, is the hedonistic archetype. This is one where you enjoy what you do, but forget the future. Then there is the hamburger, which is future benefit, but no present benefit. This is the rat race hamburger. This is about always living for the future, failing to enjoy the journey. The worst archetype is the nihilistic archetype. Now, this is mostly associated with depression, or what psychologists call learned helplessness. Nothing I do matters, no pleasure, no future, no present. The ideal burger, the happiness burger, is one where I enjoy the present and the future. This archetype can be applied to anything we do in our life. For example, what's a happy relationship? A happy relationship is one in which we enjoy our time together, yes, of course, and we're also building a future together. Then there is, there are hedonistic relationships where we just enjoy the present and, whatever comes tomorrow, I don't know. And then there are the worst relationships, of course, where we're not enjoying the present nor thinking about a future. We are helpless in those relationships. And the rat race relationships, we're there for a purpose. Why are we in this relationship? So that we can have a better future, better for our kids, all about the future, nothing about the present. Work, ideal work, once again, is work where I enjoy overall, with ups and downs, just like even in the best relationships, but overall enjoy my work, and it's meaningful, it's purposeful. I have goals that are important to me. In other words, there is also future benefits. And that, in a nutshell, is what happiness is about. How can we increase the time that we spend in the happiness quadrant? All of us have times when we're in the rat race thinking about the future. We have times when we're just feeling completely broken and down. We're in the nihilist. We have times when we're just thinking about, watching our favorite sitcom or enjoying an ice cream, just being hedonistic. And that's fine too. But how can we increase the time that we spend enjoying present benefit and future benefits? And this is not an easy question to answer, because our cultures rather, split the two. In a sense, and again, I'm using very broad brushstrokes here, but in a sense, the West is associated with the future. The East is associated with the present. So people who are in the West or identify with the approach in the West would say, what is happiness about? Happiness is about being in the future. It's about attaining your big goals. Yeah, getting to Berkeley, getting to Harvard, getting to Tsinghua University, and then get into the best investment bank, become or consulting or become the chief doctor. Doesn't matter, but become successful. And it's all about the future. And then you'll be happy. Of course, that future never arrives, because you are, you're constantly deferring happiness. And then, you get to the age of 70, 80, and you realize that you have been living in the future. That is very much the West. In the East, and again, broad brushstrokes, the focus has been much more on the present. It's no coincidence that, meditation, at least at the highest level, comes out of India, that Qigong, Tai Chi come out, of China, that yoga comes, what are all these practices? They're about present moment awareness. And in many ways, and people say, no, this is what happiness is about, present moment awareness. So we have these two competing worldviews. And the thing is, these two worldviews can and should meet, because we can have future goals, because we are also future oriented by our very nature. And we also need to learn how to enjoy the present moment, because that is where happiness does reside as well. And the question is, how can we reconcile? How can we have this perfect burger, in a sense, or the ideal burger, rather, that is both about present benefit and future benefit? This is the question when it comes to happiness. And the answer is at the intersection, the synthesis between East and West. And this is why it's so important for children to read the Gitas and the writings of the Buddha and the Tao Te Ching, as well as read about Shakespeare and read the Iliad and Odyssey that very much emphasize goal and success and flourishing.
Yeah. Wow. It's funny because you kind of summarized a good amount of the book in just that monologue. But I had a couple of questions around the concepts of idealism and realism as well as goals. And you said when we set realism and idealism in opposition to one another, when we live as though having ideals and dreams are unrealistic and detached, we're allowing a false dichotomy to hold us back. And the reason that intrigued me so much is that I often see people who set, wildly ambitious goals, like become, the next Steve Jobs, which most of us probably never will. So, how do you have that, coexistence or balance between idealism and realism? And then the other thing, about goals that you said was that, I believe that goals are indispensable to a happy life. To be happy, we need to identify and pursue goals that are both pleasurable and meaningful. But before looking at the relationship between setting goals and feeling good, let's consider the relationship between setting goals and doing well. And the reason that struck me is because I just finished reading Oliver Berkman's book, The Antidote, for the second time. And he had some really interesting takes on goals that I think challenged a lot of what we think we know about goals, even to the point of suggesting the idea of goal-free living. And so how do you resolve these bizarre paradoxes?
Yeah, so it's important to understand what is the goal of goals. The goal of goals is not to attain them and then we'll be happy, or live happily ever after. The goal of goals is actually to facilitate the enjoyment of the present moment. So take an example. If I go on a road trip and I have no idea where I'm going, in other words, I have no goal, I'm first of all likely to get lost, and I'm going to constantly be marred by indecision and constantly be marred by inattentiveness to the moment. I mean, think about days when you woke up and you had no idea what you wanted to do. And, once in a while it's nice, or for a short period of time it's nice, but after a while we feel lost and unhappy. So having a goal, a place where we want to get to, is important. However, once we have that goal, we need to let go of it, because its purpose when it comes to happiness is not the achievement of the goal, but rather its purpose is so that we can be liberated to enjoy the present moment. And I'll give you an example. So right now I'm working on a book. I have a goal. I want this book out on, as I've committed, on April 27. In order for the book to be out, I need to be working on it every day. But now I have this goal, I can let go of it. And every morning when I wake up, I sit down for my 2 90-minute sessions and write. And I know that by doing that, I will get to my goal. But the goal is not front and center anymore. What's front and center is every day I get up and I work for those 3 hours on writing. And I'm liberated to enjoy the process. Now, if I woke every morning and I said, look, I have 3 hours now, what should I do today? Should I write today? Oh, no, maybe I should actually just watch, The Big Bang Theory for 3 hours. That's not the path to happiness. The path to happiness is having a clear goal and then letting go of it and just doing what is necessary in the here and now to get there.
Wow. So, okay, there are a couple of things here. I want to ask you two last questions. One was specifically about love. I just really loved everything you had to say about relationships. And I think the thing that struck me most, you said that mistaking pleasure for love, the hedonist in a relationship mistakes lust for love. The hedonist's pleasure inevitably fades because without a meaningful foundation to the relationship that goes beyond immediate gratification, it's impossible to sustain happiness. And then the other thing you said is the problem is that movies end where love begins. It's the living happily ever after that poses the greatest challenge. It's after the sun sets that the difficulties often rise. Which it's funny because it's taken me years to get my head around the fact that life is not a romantic comedy. One of my friends was like, I think you have this idealized Disney version of what your love life is going to be like. And I think when I finally came to terms with that, I stopped going into every date expecting to find the love of my life. And, it just made things easier. But in a culture where that is so embedded into us through pop culture, the world around us, people putting these like perfect pictures of their like beautiful, happy relationships on Instagram, how do you actually get past that narrative?
Yeah, you asked earlier about idealism and realism. To have ideals is important. At the same time, it's also important to be realistic about those ideals. Realism and idealism need to coexist, just as future and present need to coexist. Specifically when it comes to relationship, if my expectation is that I'll find the love of my life and will get married or commit to one another through our vows, and then we'll live happily ever after. And that means being in lust and love every moment of our lives, just like it seems the movies tell us. Then I'm in for disappointment. These are great expectations. There are false expectations, and I will inevitably experience frustration and much unhappiness. If, on the other hand, I know that relationships are about work. They're about investment. It can be enjoyable work, pleasant work. Relationships are also about ups and downs in even the best of relationships. Then I have a more realistic expectation, and then I'm more likely to find happiness. You see, here is the metaphor. Think about it. Let's say you've been looking for your ideal job, and you've been looking for years for this ideal job. And finally you found it. And on Monday morning, you're ready to go into work, to your ideal job, your ideal office, everything is just perfect there. And you go into your office and you sit down on your new, beautiful chair, and you put your legs up on the table and you say, I found it. I got it. I found my ideal job. I'm just so happy, and I'm ready to have a good time here from now and forevermore for the rest of my life. And that's it. Well, you know what will happen is probably 5 minutes later, or at most a day later, your colleagues or boss will come in and say, you're fired. You came here to work, not to put, your feet on the table. Now, of course, we know that intuitively, and we want to invest. We come in and we work harder than we'd ever worked before because we did find our ideal job. And yet in relationships, the opposite happens. We find our ideal partner, we think, okay, now that we have found our ideal partner, we can just live happily ever after and do nothing. This is why I say that movies end where love begins. This is where the hard work begins. This is where the investment in the relationship needs to start or to increase. It's when it's after the commitment, after we have found, then we need to do the work, and that's how you cultivate healthy long-term relationships. Not perfect relationships, just like there is no perfect parent. But relationships where you do grow closer and closer, become more and more intimate with each other. But that takes work. That takes time. That doesn't just happen because you found the perfect partner. Because the perfect partner doesn't exist. What you're doing is you found someone you're compatible with, and now the work begins.
Wow. So I have two last questions for you. So you talk in the Meditations on Happiness, and we don't have time to get into all of them, but one of them in particular struck me, and it was around the idea of self-interest and benevolence. And you say, we often enhance our happiness to the greatest extent when we pursue activities that provide us with meaning and pleasure and that help others. And earlier, we were talking about the fact that the West tends to be much more individualized. And this is a conversation I've been having with, my roommates. And, one of my roommates said, he's like, any good society is driven by some level of self-interest. But do you feel that to some degree we've pushed self-interest to the point of diminishing returns? Because look at sort of the inequality we've created. Look at the crisis we've created around the world. Part of that to me is self-interest pushed to the extreme.
I think what we need to recognize is that self-interest and the interest of others are two sides of the same coin. Once again, we see an unhealthy split, a schism that exists. Again, just like the schism between present and future exists. And that schism that I'm talking about is between selfishness and selflessness. You see, when people very, very often criticize the field of happiness studies, they say, oh, but this is all about a selfish pursuit. And my answer to that is yes, in part it is. Now, they say it pointing to a problem, because you go to the thesaurus, to the dictionary, and you look for synonyms for selfishness. What do you find? You find words such as evil, immoral, self-interested, inconsiderate. These are all synonyms to the word selfish. So it's a bad thing. On the other hand, you go selfless, and selfless is, altruistic, helpful, nice, kind, generous, benevolent. So that's a good thing. So there is a real schism that exists, and people are upset because they have to choose. Because on the one hand, part of their nature is that they look out for their self-interest. At the same time, they're constantly told that that doing things in your self-interest is a bad thing, that being selfish is immoral. So what do you do? What you do is you reconcile the two, because we have a lot of research showing that when you help other people, when you contribute to their well-being, when you make them happy, when you give charity, when you're kind to other people, that contributes to your own happiness, arguably more than any other intervention. So to give is to receive. So that's one side of the equation. We also know at the same time that when you cultivate your own happiness, when you increase your well-being, you become more generous, more benevolent. So potentially, there exists a self-reinforcing loop between giving to others and giving to yourself. That each time I help others, I'm also helping myself. And when I help myself, by extension, I'm more likely to help others. And this self-reinforcing loop is the loop that we need to teach and cultivate and encourage in our culture. And in order to do that, we need to put an end to the unhealthy schism. Because, first there was the world. Words create worlds, concepts conceive. And it's important for us to have the right words, the right understanding of words. So rather than talking about selfishness versus selflessness, we need to talk about selffulness. And selffulness is where concern for the self and concern for others are merged, are reconciled, are synthesized.
Amazing. Well, I have one last question, which is how we finish all of our interviews with the Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Authenticity. To thine own self be true.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story and your insights and wisdom with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, your book? I know that you guys have a course that you've started as well. So let people know where they can find out about all of that.
Yes, so we have the Happiness Studies Academy, where we launch courses every few months. And these are courses that focus on helping answering two questions. The first question, how can I become happier? The question, how can I help others become happier? As applied to the workplace, to schools, to homes, to the individuals, as well as to the collective. So, and you can find more information on that through the happinessstudies.academy website.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
Holiday season means stocking up on some essentials like decorations and an ugly sweater. With a Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, you can choose to earn 3% cash back on online shopping. The essentials have never felt more rewarding. Visit bankofamerica.com/more rewarding to apply now. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.